Hello, this is 2Minton doing my therapeutic relationship report presentation. The framework that I chose was the Transtheoretical Model. So by the end of this little presentation, you should be able to explain the stages of change and the other core Transtheoretical Model constructs. You should also be able to identify how the Transtheoretical Model can be Hello, this is 2Minton doing my therapeutic relationship report presentation. The framework that I chose was the Transtheoretical Model. So by the end of this little presentation, you should be able to explain the stages of change and the other core Transtheoretical Model constructs. You should also be able to identify how the Transtheoretical Model can be tailored to individuals and how motivational interviewing not only enhances but is really essential to the Transtheoretical model of change. Now, the Transtheoretical Model, or stages of change, is a framework for understanding how people progress from one type of behavior to another. It's often imagined as a scale from pre-contemplation all the way to maintenance or termination, but the way that TTM thinks about change is that it's not necessarily linear, and the stages themselves aren't even entirely discrete. Someone can have features of one stage, though they are primarily in another. Now, this framework was developed by Prochaska and Di Clemente in the late 1970s and early 80s, and it seeks to identify the client's unique attributes in order to help counselors or helpers create the right stage-matched intervention. That is the intervention that's appropriate for the stage of change in which their client is in. And constructs within the Transtheoretical Model include the stages of change, includes decisional balance, the client's list of pros and cons, and the client's self-efficacy. Now, TTM has been shown to be fairly effective when applied in a number of different behavioral change venues like weight management, eating disorders, and stress management. But there's some counter evidence to show that TTM isn't always the best way to describe a client's progression towards change. For example, in addiction treatment, TTM, the stages aren't necessarily descriptive of whether or not a client is going to move towards a higher level of change. However, when TTM has been studied for multiple behavior change programs, that is, looking at someone like a diabetic who has a bunch of different behaviors that are risk factors for poor health outcomes, TTM was shown to be a fairly effective way to help the client engage in change for all of those different types of risky behaviors. Now, the stages of change within the Transtheoretical Model include pre-contemplation, where a client is really unmotivated to change, or they might even be resistant to change. Now, that could be because their pros and cons list for change are lopsided. They see more cons than pros. They might not see any pros at all. It could also be because they already tried to change in the past and failed, so their self-efficacy is very low. They feel like they can't change. The contemplation phase is characterized by ambivalence. This is the client is aware of the pros of changing, but their cons list outweighs it. The preparation stage is where the client has recognized the need or a desire to change, and they might even have a plan, but they haven't yet implemented it. And that's once they implement their plan, once they start making behavioral modifications, they're in the action stage, and that occurs when they start engaging in change behaviors over the course of 6 months to a year. The maintenance phase describes the time when a patient has engaged in behavior change, they are less likely to revert back to their unhealthy behaviors, and their self-efficacy, their self-confidence is much higher than it was during the pre-contemplation phase. The termination phase is the 6th stage of change in the Transtheoretical Model that isn't always talked about because research doesn't show that it's as effective a description of the way that people change over time, but it can be beneficial to think about this long-term maintenance stage where a client's self-efficacy is very high. They have very little temptation to revert back to their unhealthy behaviors, even when presented with depression or loneliness or boredom. They still have faith in themselves that they'll stick with their new, healthier behaviors. Now, the stages of change, the reason that it's important to describe a stage of change is so that the counselor can appropriately match their intervention to where the client's at. And this is important because if a counselor tries to give advice, if they try and set up an action plan before a client is ready, it can result in resistance. It makes it harder for the counseling relationship to progress towards change. For example, if the counselor tries to institute counterconditioning, this idea of substituting healthier behaviors for less healthy behaviors while the client is in a state of ambivalence. They don't know whether they want to change. Maybe they regret the changes they've already made. They're going to become resistant to the therapeutic process. So it's very, very important that the counselor, whether they're using TTM or not, they recognize where the client is at in their own process of change so that they don't step over their bounds and get resistance from the client. So the heart of the Transtheoretical Model is that it's client-centered and goal-oriented. It revolves around recognizing and developing the client's intrinsic motivations for change, and then applying the appropriate motivational strategies based on the stage of change in which the client's in order to help them progress towards behavior change. So this should raise the question of if it's so important to identify the stage of change a client's in and apply the appropriate strategy to help them move forward, how do you identify what stage of change a client's in? The answer is that you listen to your client and you really hear them. And the corollary of that is that the client really speaks to you, that they tell you how they really feel, what they really think, what they really want out of life. And all of that requires a trusting therapeutic alliance. It means that the client needs to trust that the counselor has their best interest at heart, that they are really working towards the goals that the client wants to achieve, and that they're non-judgmental, that they're not going to judge them when they're honest about the fact that they've maybe slipped up or they have some behaviors that aren't optimal. So the counselor has to be reserve judgment, be empathetic, really care about the client, and really hear who the client is and what they want. That allows the counselor to identify at any given session what stage of change their client is in. And that brings me to motivational interviewing, because this is a very good way, a very effective strategy of counseling or style of counseling that creates this supportive therapeutic relationship, this rapport between helper and client. Now, motivational interviewing is in many ways similar to the Transtheoretical Model of change. They both are client-centered. They're both focused on goals. They both consider the client's intrinsic motivations when trying to affect change. However, they're not the same. The Transtheoretical Model of change is a conceptual model, whereas motivational interviewing is a style of counseling. As the developers of motivational interview described it, the two are kissing cousins who never married. Motivational interviewing has been shown to be an effective counseling approach, regardless of the framework for which the counselor is using. However, I believe that the Transtheoretical Model of change requires motivational interviewing in order to be effective, in order to build that rapport and that relationship where the client is able to be honest with their counselor so that the counselor can identify what stage of change they're in and help them move through the stages towards change. The spirit of motivational interviewing is an approach where the counselor really respects the client's autonomy, really cares about the client's goals. It's not so focused on achieving the particular goal that is set out, but more about helping the client. You know, if the client doesn't move through the stages of change, the counselor reserves judgment. The counselor is unhurried, is a good way to describe motivational interviewing. It's about helping the client achieve the goals that they want, not necessarily any particular outcome that the counselor wants. As I heard it described, it's the client's job to institute any kind of plan of change. It's the counselor's responsibility to present a plan, not their responsibility to actually make the client adhere to any particular plan. And for the counselor, motivational interviewing requires them to roll with resistance and be very empathetic. And empathy is so important to any particular therapeutic approach that a counselor takes, because that's what allows the client to really believe in their counselor. And that's so important for them to be honest and to want to change, to believe that they can implement the plan that the two of them come up with in order to change. So that's how motivational interviewing can be so integral to the Transtheoretical Model of change. and I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.